My father-in-law stood up in front of 600 people at my own anniversary party and called me trash with a smile on his face. And when I finally opened my mouth to defend myself, my husband, the man who promised to protect me, walked over and slapped me so hard I flew backward into a 10-tier champagne tower. Glass everywhere. 600 of the richest people in Charleston, and every single one of them laughed. Nobody moved. Nobody helped me up. So I wiped the blood off my lip, I stood up on my own 2 feet, and I walked to the ladies' room and made one phone call. 2 words. Dad, come. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you the most, you are going to want to stay for this one. Welcome back to Silent Revenge. Hit that subscribe button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're tuned in from tonight, because I promise you the way this story ends is going to make your night. Let's get into it. My name is Elle. I'm 32, and for the last 9 years I've run a small historic restoration business in Charleston called Magnolia Row Restorations. I fix up old houses, rotting joists, crumbling porches, 100-year-old brick nobody else wants to touch. Quiet work. I own exactly 1 black dress for fancy events, and I've never once cared that it isn't designer. My husband, Brad, is the opposite of me in every possible way. 35 years old, vice president at his dad's investment firm, Kingston Wealth Partners. Brad lives for a room full of people looking at him. Tailored suits, a car that costs more than some of the houses I restore, and a hunger for approval that I used to think was charming and later understood was something closer to an addiction. We've been married 10 years. On the night I'm about to tell you about, we were at the Palmetto Club, the most exclusive country club in the state, for the 10th anniversary gala of his dad's firm. 600 guests, crystal chandeliers, a string quartet, waiters in white gloves pouring champagne that cost more per bottle than my monthly grocery bill. I stood near our table in my one good dress, holding sparkling water, trying to be invisible. My mother-in-law, Vivian, was across the room in a gown that cost more than my first car, diamonds stacked up her neck like armor. My sister-in-law, Tatum, stood beside her husband, Julian Reyes, the family's corporate attorney, a man who never once asked about my life without also quietly assessing it. He nursed his bourbon and watched the room like a courtroom he already knew he'd win. I always tried to stay small around that family. My quiet existence had always felt to them like a stain on the tablecloth they were too polite to mention, until they weren't. My father-in-law, Walter, walked up to the podium. The band stopped. 600 people went quiet, and Walter tapped his champagne glass with a spoon, soaking in every second of the silence he'd created. "Thank you all for celebrating 10 years of excellence with us tonight," he began, his voice booming through the sound system. "We built this firm the way we built our family, on discipline, on legacy, on understanding that success isn't an accident. It's bred." Polite laughter. I kept my eyes on my glass, praying he'd move on to thanking the caterers. He didn't. "Of course," Walter continued, and I felt his eyes land right on me. "A legacy like ours comes with responsibility. We believe in giving back. And nobody embodies that more than my son, Brad, who took his charitable instincts and brought them home with him." A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd, people not yet sure where this was going. Walter raised his glass higher and pointed it unmistakably at me. 10 years ago, Brad could have married into any family in this room. Instead, he chose to elevate a woman starting from absolute zero, a woman who spends her days crawling around other people's basements pretending it's a career. He gave her a name, a home, a seat at this table. Takes a generous man to look past that kind of pedigree and try to polish a rock hoping it'll shine like a diamond someday. So please, raise a glass to Brad and his relentless charity. The room erupted. 600 people laughing at me in front of my own husband on our own anniversary. I looked at Vivian, smirking behind her champagne flute. I looked at Tatum, giggling into Julian's shoulder while he just shook his head, unbothered, sipping his drink like this was mildly amusing weather. And then I looked at Brad. My husband. The man I had built 10 years of my life around. I waited for him to stand up. To defend me. to prove that our marriage meant more to him than his dad's approval. Instead, Brad raised his glass, turned toward his dad, and clinked it in total agreement. That was the moment something in my chest went cold and quiet forever. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that because it matters for everything that comes next. I didn't cry. I just felt the warmth of 10 years evaporate out of me in about 4 seconds flat. There was a little jazz combo set up near our table with a microphone on a silver stand. I didn't run to the bathroom. I didn't storm out. I walked, slow and deliberate, straight toward that microphone, my dress brushing the marble floor. I could see Vivian nudging Tatum, both of them delighted, assuming they were about to watch me dissolve into tears in front of everyone. They wanted the full show. I picked up the mic, tapped it twice. The sound cracked through the speakers and cut every conversation in that ballroom dead. 600 faces turned to look at me. Walter's smile faltered. "Thank you, Walter, for that toast," I said, keeping my voice level and pleasant. "You're right that my background is different from yours. I spend my days finding the rot hiding inside old buildings before they collapse. And speaking of things about to collapse," I paused, just long enough to feel the room hold its breath. "It's only fair everyone here understands exactly how far my charity really goes in this family. 'Cause last month my little construction business was busy enough that I personally wired $200,000 into Brad's trading account, just in time to cover a margin call that would have wiped out this firm 48 hours later. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. 600 of the wealthiest people in the state, and not one of them breathed." "So you're right, Walter," I said, staring straight at him. "I do fix crumbling foundations for a living. I just happen to fix yours. If you've made it this far, comment below the word foundation, because trust me, that word is about to matter a whole lot more before this story's over. And don't go anywhere because what happens in the next 60 seconds is the reason I started this channel in the first place." The whispering started like wildfire. Investors leaned into each other. People who'd trusted Walter with their retirement accounts stared at him like he was a stranger. Vivian's glass slipped from her hand and shattered, and she didn't even glance down. Julian's face went hard and calculating. I watched him realize in real time that the quiet daughter-in-law he'd ignored for a decade knew exactly where the bodies were buried. And Brad started shaking. Every ounce of the image he'd spent his whole life building gone in front of the very people whose approval he lived for. "You shut your mouth," he screamed, and he came at me across that ballroom floor so fast that people scrambled their chairs out of the way. I didn't move. I didn't think he'd actually do it. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life. He swung his open hand and caught the side of my face so hard the room went white. My feet left the floor. I spun backward into the champagne tower and went down with it, glasses exploding around me, champagne and blood mixing on white marble, crystal slicing through the thin fabric of my dress. I lay there a full second, staring up at the chandeliers, and not one person in that room of 600 moved to help me. Not one. I pushed myself up onto my hands, glass biting into my palms, and looked toward the crowd. Tatum was laughing behind her hand. Julian just sipped his bourbon and watched, already calculating the legal cleanup. I stood up on my own. Champagne dripping off me, blood on my lip, and I picked that microphone back up off the wreckage, looked Brad dead in the eye, and dropped it. The feedback screeched through the whole ballroom. Then I turned around and walked out, head high. Every single guest stepped aside to clear a path for me because nobody in that room for the first time all night knew what to say. I locked myself in the club's restroom and looked in the mirror. A bruise already blooming across my cheekbone. My lips split open. And underneath all of that, for the first time in 10 years, I felt something that wasn't shame. I felt free. I pulled my cracked phone out of my dress. I scrolled past every name in that family. I stopped on a number I hadn't dialed in almost a decade, a name that used to make grown men in three-piece suits go quiet the second it was mentioned. Rang once. No assistant. No secretary. Just a deep, steady voice that said one word. Al. I closed my eyes. I didn't explain the gala, the toast, the slap, any of it. I just said 3 words. Dad, please come. He didn't ask a single question. That's the thing about my dad. He never needed the whole story to know exactly what to do. Okay, before we go any further, if you're new here, this is Silent Revenge, and we tell stories about people who got underestimated and made somebody deeply, deeply regret it. Smash that subscribe button because what my dad does next is the reason this channel exists. I hung up, splashed cold water on my face, and my phone buzzed again. Text from Brad. Don't bother coming home. You're getting nothing. Julian's already drafting the papers. I read it twice, memorized every word, and put my phone away. He thought he still held all the cards. He had absolutely no idea the game had already changed. I took a cab to the house, the historic Charleston single house near the Battery I'd spent 3 years personally restoring, board by board. I punched in the door code. Red light. Access denied. Julian had moved fast, already changing the locks to cut me off from my passport, my documents, everything I owned. They forgot who actually rebuilt that house. Years ago, during the foundation work, I'd insisted on keeping an old coal chute window in the basement instead of sealing it in concrete like Brad wanted, and had the contractor rig a hidden latch instead. I knelt in the wet grass in my ruined dress, found the cold metal lever, and popped it open. I slipped through into the pitch-black basement and felt my way up the stairs by memory, barefoot on the wood floors of a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to strangers. I only needed my passport, my hard drive, and a few things. I pushed open the door to our bedroom and stopped cold. 6 black trash bags lined the wall. My clothes spilling out the top, silk blouses, work trousers, the cashmere sweater my best friend Dana gave me for my 30th birthday. All of it stuffed into garbage bags like it was worthless. He hadn't packed my things. He'd thrown them away. And on the bed, sitting right on my side of the pillows, was a piece of red lace lingerie that had never belonged to me. I stood there for a second, just processing it. Not just a bad husband. Not just an abusive one. A cheater, too, and apparently not a careful one. He'd had someone in our home, the home I built with my own 2 hands while I was out working to save his family from bankruptcy. I changed into jeans and a sweater, grabbed my passport and my hard drive from the safe, and I was 1 step from the hallway when I heard the front door's electronic lock click open downstairs. Footsteps. 2 sets. Brad's voice laughing about something. And underneath it, Julian's voice, calm and clinical, already talking about freezing my bank accounts by morning. They were coming straight up the stairs. And they had no idea I was already standing in the dark, waiting. The lights flicked on. Brad froze the second he saw my ruined dress on the floor. He knew immediately I'd gotten past his precautions. You always were a stubborn problem, he sneered, stepping aside so Julian could walk in, dropping a thick leather folder onto our bed, right next to that piece of red lace like it was nothing. Let's make this simple, Elle, Julian said, in that same courtroom voice he used on everyone. You humiliated Walter tonight. You threatened this family's stability. So here's your postnup. That's what it's officially called anyway. What it actually is a very carefully worded exit. I asked him how, exactly, he planned to enforce a postnup drafted after the fact. He smiled like he'd been waiting for the question. Turns out, 18 months earlier, Julian had convinced me, as the family attorney just simplifying your taxes, to route my business account through a joint holding account for efficiency. I remember him at Thanksgiving, so reasonable, promising it would save me a headache every April. I trusted him. That was my mistake. Every dollar I'd earned for 18 months had been quietly funneled through shell companies and parked in an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands, with Tatum listed as the sole beneficiary. My savings, my business profits, gone legally on paper into my sister-in-law's name. You have no claim to your own money, Julian said. You're bankrupt, Elle. Completely. Brad actually laughed, picked up the lingerie off the bed and tossed it onto the floor like it was nothing. You thought wiring 200 grand made you powerful? You're a glorified contractor. We took your money because you were too naive to notice. Now you've got no family, no savings, and nowhere to sleep tonight. Julian clicked a silver pen and held it out to me. Sign the last page, take the $5,000 relocation check we're offering, and walk. Or I bury you in litigation until you're 70 years old. Imagine that moment. Bruised face, homeless in 10 minutes, everything I'd built apparently gone. And still, I didn't reach for that pen. I picked up that thick folder instead, flipped through it just long enough to see the gag order buried on page 6, the non-compete clause designed to end my career permanently, the line admitting I'd caused the marriage to fail due to erratic behavior. And then I gripped it with both hands and tore the entire thing clean in half, and let it fall on Julian's expensive shoes. Brad laughed at me. Actually laughed, like tearing up a piece of paper was the funniest thing he'd seen all night. You've got nothing, Al. No family. No trust fund. No daddy to come save you. You're a stray we brought in from the cold, and now you're going right back out. He grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a mark and shoved me toward the stairs. Julian followed, calm as ever, already talking about filing paperwork by morning. Brad marched me through the foyer and threw open the front door. A full-on storm had rolled in, freezing rain, wind howling sideways. He shoved me out onto the wet stone porch. "Welcome back to the real world," he said and slammed the door. I heard the deadbolt click. I stood on the curb, soaked to the bone, gripping my one bag in a dark, silent, ridiculously wealthy neighborhood. And if you think this is where I broke down crying, stick with me because this is exactly where it stops being that kind of story. Because that's when headlights cut through the rain. Not one car. 3 matching black SUVs gliding up the street in perfect formation and stopping directly in front of me like they'd been choreographed. Behind me, the door flew open again. Brad and Julian stepped out onto the porch, clearly expecting to see me crawling away in the dark. Instead, they saw a convoy that probably cost more than their combined salaries idling at the curb. The back door of the lead SUV opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out into the pouring rain without flinching, popped open a huge black umbrella, and held the door. And then my dad stepped out. My dad's name is Marcus Cross. He runs Cross Capital Group, a private equity firm most people in that neighborhood had definitely heard of and feared a little. I hadn't seen him in 10 years, not since I walked away from that world, determined to build something entirely mine. He walked straight through the puddles like they weren't there. Didn't glance at the house. Didn't look at Brad. He looked only at me, my soaked clothes, my bare feet on the freezing concrete, the bruise blooming on my cheek. I watched his jaw tighten and watched his security guard go rigid because that man had probably never once seen him lose his composure, and he was right on the edge of it now. My dad didn't yell. He never does. He just took off his own coat, wrapped it around my shoulders, tucked it tight, and said, "Get in, sweetheart. Their game is over." From the porch, Brad let out this nervous, mocking laugh, still not understanding what he was looking at. "Who is this, Elle? You call a taxi service to come pick you up out of the gutter?" My dad turned his head just slightly and looked at Brad the way you'd look at something you found stuck to the bottom of your shoe. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. I watched Brad actually take a step back. My dad put his hand on my back, guided me into the SUV, slid in beside me, and the convoy pulled away into the storm, leaving Brad and Julian standing on that porch getting smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. If you're still with me, comment "Let's go" below because we are just getting started, and what my dad and I built over the next 48 hours is the entire reason this story is called what it's called. Also, go ahead and hit that like button right now so this story reaches more people who need to hear it. Genuinely helps. Back on that porch, Brad shook his head and told Julian it didn't matter, that the postnup still stood, that I'd be broke by morning. Julian didn't answer right away. His phone had just started buzzing, an emergency alert from the firm's banking app. He looked down and went pale. A massive withdrawal attempt on their operating line had just been blocked by an unknown outside entity. Their liquidity frozen instantly. They had no idea it was only the very beginning. We drove into downtown Charleston, down into the private garage beneath Cross Tower, up 60 floors into my dad's penthouse, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking a city getting hammered by the storm. His personal doctor was already waiting because my dad never leaves anything to chance. He checked my jaw for fractures, treated the bruise, and left quietly. I stood at the window with a cup of tea, and my dad stood beside me with a glass of scotch, watching my reflection instead of the storm. 10 years, he said. You spent them proving you could survive without any of this. Did you find what you were looking for? I told him the truth. No. I'd wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I came from, and instead I'd married a man who tolerated me until I stopped being convenient, then stole from me and threw me into a storm. You survived, my dad said. But surviving is for people with no other options. You have options. So now we stop surviving and start conquering. He handed me a tablet. A live financial feed. Not public information, the kind you only get from very deep, very private channels, tracking Kingston Wealth Partners' internal numbers in real time. Read across the board. They were leveraged to their eyeballs on a commercial development downtown that I had personally warned Brad about months earlier at our own dinner table. I told him the foundation had a water table issue that would blow the budget. He told me I didn't understand real finance. Turns out that project was now $60 million over budget, and they were bleeding client money trying to keep it afloat. That's why they took your money, I said, mostly to myself. They're not thieves for sport. They're drowning. They had 5 days until a massive loan payment came due. If they defaulted, the whole firm went down with it. And to survive, they needed $150 million, and the only people wealthy enough in the region to even consider it were, unknowingly, my dad's firm. They were about to walk into our building and beg the very woman they'd thrown into a storm to save their lives. The next morning, I called my best friend Dana, who owns a little bakery 2 blocks from my old office, the one person who'd known the real me since we were 19 years old and broke together. I told her everything over the phone while she sat in her empty shop before opening. She didn't say, "I told you so," even though she probably could have. She just said, "Go get him, Elle," and that was exactly what I needed to hear. While I was building the case that would end them, Vivian and Tatum handed me the last piece of proof I needed, without even realizing it. Assuming the bailout was already secured, Vivian launched a smear campaign through the club's gossip network, telling anyone who'd listen I'd been embezzling from Brad for years and run off with some rich sugar daddy the night of the gala. Tatum added her own flourishes. Meanwhile, Brad spent his morning calling in favors, getting my restoration contracts pulled from 3 preservation boards, blacklisting me across the whole city in a single afternoon. He texted me a screenshot of the cancellation email with one gloating line. "Told you. You're finished here." I didn't respond. Silence, it turns out, is a far more terrifying answer than anything I could have typed. Instead, I walked into Cross Capital's financial war room and sat with my dad's lead forensic accountant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata, already tracing the origin of the unencumbered capital Kingston Wealth Partners had proudly listed on their bailout application. It didn't take her long. The $40 million they claimed as cash on hand wasn't theirs. Julian had drained it from client escrow accounts, a local teacher's pension fund, retirees who trusted that family with their life savings, laundered through shell companies into the same offshore trust holding my stolen earnings, then presented as proof of financial strength. That wasn't just theft anymore. That was wire fraud. Securities violations. Federal crimes sitting right there in black and white. Renata slid the file across the table. "This isn't a divorce case anymore, Elle. This is an SEC referral. If we send this over, federal agents will be at their office by tomorrow afternoon." I could have handed it straight to the authorities right then. Part of me wanted to, but I didn't want them arrested quietly in some office while they still believed they'd won. I wanted them to walk into it themselves, wide awake, and understand exactly who had built the trap. So I told my dad to hold the file for 24 hours, and I personally approved Kingston Wealth Partners for an emergency in-person bailout meeting. 9 a.m. the next morning. Cross Tower. Final signing. They thought they'd been approved. They had absolutely no idea they were walking straight into me. That night, while Brad and Julian celebrated with cigars, convinced they'd outsmarted the biggest firm on the East Coast, Tatum took Kingston's corporate card on a $500,000 shopping spree, fully confident the accounts she was draining were about to be refilled. I let her charge every last cent of it. Made what came next hit even harder. The next morning, in a charcoal suit with the bruise carefully concealed under makeup, I walked into the boardroom on the 60th floor flanked by 5 of my dad's top attorneys. Walter and Brad already sat on leather stools across a table carved from petrified wood, no chairs on their side. Not an accident. That's exactly how my dad builds a room meant to remind you who's in charge. Walter looked up and scoffed. What is this? Did they send my humiliated daughter-in-law in here to serve coffee? I didn't answer him. I sat down in the chair at the head of the table, opened their bailout file, and started reading their own numbers back to them, line by line, the offshore trusts, the client escrow accounts, the shell companies, every fraudulent dollar accounted for out loud in a voice that never once raised in volume. I watched Walter's face go from arrogance to confusion to full, sickly white panic in under 2 minutes. Brad slammed his hand on the table. Shut your mouth. I don't know how you got in this building, but you have no authority here. I slid a single business card across the table instead of answering him. It landed an inch from his shaking hand. Elena Cross, Executive Vice President, Cross Capital Group. I watched every ounce of color drain out of his face. He hadn't just slapped his wife in front of 600 people. He'd slapped the one person on Earth whose family held the only lifeline that could save his. That's when Julian burst through the doors, sweating, his tie loose, screaming that federal auditors had just raided their office lobby and frozen every account they had. He froze mid-sentence when he saw me sitting at the head of that table, and I watched the exact moment he understood he'd walked straight into a trap he helped build with his own hands. I told Walter his firm was denied. That he'd default within the hour and be filing for bankruptcy by evening. I told Julian his career, his license, his freedom, all of it was already over because federal agents were currently seizing every account he thought he'd hidden. I told Brad, who had, by that point, actually dropped to his knees on the floor, sobbing, begging me to fix it, swearing he'd end the affair, swearing it was all his dad's and Julian's fault, that I wasn't going to hit him back because hitting a man already on the ground would make me exactly like him. Instead, I told him I was taking away the only thing that ever made him feel powerful in the first place, the money, the house, the cars, all of it, in a revised divorce decree that left him holding 100% of the debt he'd personally signed for. My dad walked in right as security escorted all 3 of them out of the building. He looked down at Brad being carried out, sobbing, and just said, "Get these people out of my building," and that was that. 6 months later, I stood on the steps of a fully restored Victorian mansion in Charleston's historic district, a building I bought and rebuilt myself, board by board, using my own money, my own hands, and turned into a transitional shelter for women rebuilding their lives after abuse. Dana catered the opening with her bakery. My dad texted me that morning, "The foundation is solid. I'm proud of you." A young woman named Grace, one of the shelter's very first residents, walked up to me at the ribbon cutting and told me that for the first time in 2 years, she felt safe enough to sleep with the lights off. That's the moment that actually got me more than any boardroom ever could. As for the rest, Julian's awaiting federal trial, fetching coffee at a small firm that couldn't care less about his old reputation. Vivian and Tatum share a 2-bedroom apartment now, selling off their own jewelry to make rent. And Brad's stocking shelves in the plumbing aisle of a hardware store outside the city, wearing an orange vest about as far from a country club as you can get. I spent 10 years making myself smaller, and it nearly cost me everything. The only reason I got it back was because I finally stopped being quiet. So if there's one thing I want you to take from tonight, it's this: the people who truly love you were never going to need you to be smaller. If this one hit home, hit subscribe, tell me in the comments which part got you the most, and I'll see you in the next silent revenge story, because trust me, there's always another one.